Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Pearson Centre. This is our Change Conference, and it's a conference that we've been holding every year. And in this new COVID world, we're doing it virtually, which is allowing us to bring in some pretty spectacular people from across the country, which, of course, the Pearson Centre is a pan-national organization that works to bring people and ideas together and then promote them and put them out there for governments and other authorities that they could actually make good use of good public policy. We're delighted today that our first session is a webinar called Economic Rebuilding Across the Prairies. And who better to have as a guest to speak to us for these next few moments but our own Honorable Jim Carr. Many of you will remember him in multiple portfolios in his career at the federal level of government. Natural Resources, Minister of International Trade, and prior to that, he even launched the first Business Council for Manitoba. We're delighted to have Jim Carr with us to speak. And some of our co-chairs of this conference, JP Gladu, Iris Evans, you're going to meet both of them because they're going to be moderating our session. And of course, JP Gladu from A2A Rail, and also the former president of the, let me get the posting right, Canadian Aboriginal Business Council. And Iris Evans, many of you will remember her, especially if you're from out west, as a former Minister of Finance, Minister of Health, Minister of, well, just about everything. Anyway, so welcome to all of you. Let me say also taking a moment to recognize that the Pearson Centre is headquartered on the traditional lands of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples, and our speakers and audience come from across Indigenous lands and across Turtle Island. I want to take a moment finally to thank our sponsors. In this day and age, Pearson Centre and others have to be very creative over how we can raise money to do our good work. So thanks to our platinum sponsor, Bruce Power. I know you're joining us today, so welcome. And our gold sponsors are CN, the Hill Times, and a special welcome to the Vancouver Port Authority joining us for the first time. So welcome everybody. And now I'm delighted to turn it over to you, Iris, and good luck to both of you. And thank you again, Minister Carr.
Well, thank you, Sandra. It's always a pleasure to have your warm welcome. And Jim, Minister, what a thrill to see you again, looking so well and engaged on behalf of the Prairie Provinces. And I think both JP and I are honored to be a part of this panel. I have the first sort of 15 minutes roughly of questions, but JP and I have both underscored our willingness to kind of probe a little deeper from time to time if one or the other feels that need. And I'm going to try and talk less now and really ask you, what are your priorities with what you've been tasked to do by our Prime Minister? What are the priorities of a minister without portfolio, but who is looking after the Prairie Provinces?
Thanks, Iris, and it's good to see you and good to see you looking so well.
Thank you.
This computer is my airplane. I've not been on a plane in more than a year. So I ride the controls of this computer. And I can make tracks. I can move from Peace River through canola field in Saskatchewan to a hydroelectric facility in Manitoba seamlessly through a day. And I can speak to 700 people at a convention of the Saskatchewan Association of Rural Municipalities, and then I head into the Calgary Chamber of Commerce, and then I'll pop in on the Nobel Prize laureate, Dr. Michael Houghton, the University of Alberta, and I do it all from my home. I do everything from my home. I vote in the House of Commons on this machine from this chair in my house. How the world has changed. So it's a completely different kind of fatigue. Rather than getting in and out of a plane, into a taxi, into a hotel, into a restaurant, I just go from this chair downstairs and make myself a sandwich at noon. The advantage, of course, is that I can talk to an awful lot of people in a short period of time, and that's my mandate. My mandate is to listen to the people of the prairie and then to take out my megaphone, something like this, and use it around the cabinet table so that the people at the center of government have a very good understanding of what the folks in the prairie are thinking. And by the way, there's a real diversity of opinion. People have stereotypes about the prairie region. They have stereotypes about Alberta. They're all wrong because you cannot possibly encapsulate the diversity of a region with one industry or one way of thinking or seeing the world. So it's my job to talk to people about what matters most to them, particularly during this pandemic, to report back to the center of government, and then more importantly than anything else, to make sure that the policies of the government of Canada impact families, businesses, and communities in ways that are impactful to them. So that's my mandate. This machine is my vehicle, and at the moment, that's what we're left with. I'd much rather be seeing you in person, by the way, but there you are.
And certainly we relish the time when that happens, that we do see you in person, Jim. Jim, there was a growth strategy discussed for Western Canada last fall, published, and what are your thoughts about where that is? Are we moving fast enough on that? Are there some initiatives that you want to highlight for us that really are counting these days?
Things almost never move fast enough. And that's why people get impatient. And sometimes the most controversial issue in government is exactly that. It's the pace of change and how fast we are able to go while maintaining a consensus. But some things are pretty clear, at least to me, and that is that the growth in Prairie Canada has everything to do with what we produce. And I'm not only talking about energy and renewable energy and agriculture and value added agriculture and water resources. I'm also talking about the kinds of communities that we produce. And that brings into discussion immigration policy and reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, the kinds of communities that we're building out here on the prairie. And maybe the most important revelation for me, and it's not really new because I picked this up as I traveled around the world in my roles as natural resources minister and as trade minister. We are producing what the world needs and what the world wants right here in Prairie Canada. And it's only beginning to be understood, I think, as our entrepreneurs look beyond traditional trading partners, as we sign trade deals with the Europeans and with Asia. These markets are opening up to our producers. They're taking advantage of it. And it's not only the natural resources that we're so richly able to enjoy and able to produce and export, it's also our brain power. To know that we have clusters of intellectual activity in all three provinces, which really are well positioned to give the world what the world needs right now, and that is vaccines. That is cancer research, a combination of what our Nobel Prize laureate, Dr. Michael Houghton, is doing at the University of Alberta, Vito Interact in Saskatoon, the National Microbiology Lab in Winnipeg. Put all that together, and you have a cluster of pretty impressive talent. So all of those things and much more are part of the growth strategy and a part of why I think our region is so well positioned to move forward.
And Jim and Minister, if I may, can I just point out that often what people see on television is political parties bashing each other, but you've played a real statesman role in engaging the Prairie Provinces, and I congratulate you for that. Are you finding that the various provinces are working well together with you on these initiatives behind the scenes? Is there something that you could highlight for us that encourages us that there is just one taxpayer and they're watching all of you do it well?
Well, you're right. There is only one taxpayer. And it's also true that through the pandemic, Canadians have seen that when governments cooperate, more gets done. And I think the tolerance for hyper partisanship and bickering is much lower now than it was. And that's healthy. And as you know, as a former minister, it's all about relationships that you build. You spend a lot of time getting to know somebody and seek common ground, and you are able to align the interests of the people we all represent, then you got an awful lot of space to get things done and a lot less tolerance to be distracted by the things that don't matter. Politics is not easy, and you're elected to advance a point of view, and you will be opposed in that point of view, but there's never a reason for that to be disrespectful. There is never for that a reason for that to cut against the grain of the interests of the people we're there to represent. And, you know, if you conduct yourself on the high road, you'd be surprised at how many people you'll meet down that path. So it's got a lot to do with your own behavior as much as anybody else's.
Minister, a lot of oil and gas workers who may find themselves out of work right now and wonder what the future holds. And how would you respond to them about your vision of initiatives that they might participate in as they sort of find themselves in this new world where their skill sets may not be as useful as they were in the past? What would you say to them? I'm shifting gears a bit because I want people out there that are really hurting, who themselves aren't sure where the next paycheck is coming from. How do they perform? How do they access the program initiatives that you vision will take them to that new millennium?
We know they're hurting, and we know that it's so painful for a family to lose a job and to lose hope at the same time. And there has been this double whammy, particularly in Alberta and parts of Saskatchewan, where the downturn in the oil and gas sector comes at the same time as the pandemic, which had its own breaking effect that made it worse for a lot of people. So the most important thing that government can do at a moment such as that is to provide the basics that people need. And whether that's through CERB or through wage subsidy or other support programs, or even programs that are industry specific, such as the $1.7 billion of reclamation of orphaned wells, which put thousands of people to work in Alberta and British Columbia and Saskatchewan. So you look for ways where you can respond directly. I have all the numbers here. My staff has given me about 150 numbers. I'm not going to give you a lot of them, but I'm going to give you some of them. And that is that the investment in the people of Alberta in particular through the pandemic has been in the billions of dollars, because we knew urgently coming out of the gate that the most important value was to try to keep people whole during the course of the pandemic. And we did that through wage subsidy and employment protection and loans to businesses and other major investments, with an eye to be able to get through this difficult period and then to be positioned to emerge stronger. And that's your question about what's next for these unemployed oil and gas workers. Many of them will keep their jobs. Other will be part of a changing energy environment, a changing environment, by the way, that's very well understood by the entrepreneurs of the prairie, who understand as well as anybody the international flow of capital, the changing nature of the international energy landscape, with major investments in renewable sources of energy, carbon capture, utilization, and storage, thermal energy, solar power, wind power, hydrogen. All of these together make up a very dynamic mix. And I know people are hurting, and people need to have hope. And the hope is that the dynamism and the entrepreneurship of the job creators and the wealth creators, supported and enabled by government policy and about the environment within which they operate, to look forward and to be positive at a time when for some people it's not easy to be positive. I'm hopeful, and I believe that better days are ahead.
Well, it's my pleasure now to pass the baton to JP, who's just an amazing advocate on a number of fronts for Indigenous people, but also very familiar with oil and gas. And thank you, Minister. And over to you, JP, for the questions that you have.
Thanks, Iris, and it was really great to get to know you this morning, and great to see you, Minister Carr. Always enjoy spending some time with you. At this point, as you say, from our cockpits and our offices, but that's the way life is today. I really wanted to pick up on that this stream that Iris is talking about with regards to that transition. And I got caught, as you know, Minister, in a really crazy place between moving to Alberta and all of a sudden having my offer rescinded because of the downturn in the oil and gas coupled with COVID. And a lot of those communities, Indigenous and non, are having significant impacts. How do you communicate? I mean, the biggest, you couple that with the conversation you were just having with Iris with regards to, it's not exactly a rosy relationship between the feds and the Western provinces. And then you're talking about energy transition. How do you actually message that to all Canadians that, we are on the right path? And then you couple that with the climate change adoption strategy. Like how are we going to get through this? This is a tough, challenging time.
By understanding that change is inevitable, and the way in which we accommodate that change is to be smarter than our competitors. And the way to be smarter is to make strong decisions based on evidence, to make sure that the relationship among governments and between governments and the private sector is one of mutual support. There are no opponents here, there are only partners. So the job of the national government is to work with provinces to set standards. We have international obligations to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We're doing that. We are more and more sustainably extracting resources conventionally, at the same time as investors and entrepreneurs are moving a portion of their investment to renewable sources of energy, as I articulated a few minutes ago. Meanwhile, for those people who are hurting in their families and in their communities, there have to be support programs, the opportunity to reskill, to look at opportunities to find the skills that are going to be needed in the next generation. And people are capable of making those changes. And I think that government is there to enable this job growth within the private sector. That's how we approach it. We don't have the capacity to create jobs on our own. We do, though, have a very important partnership role to play with the entrepreneur who takes the risks, who uses this investment capital to move us to the next phase. That's happening. It's happening at a pace that people didn't expect. But I understand, and my experience as natural resources minister helped me understand this very well, that this is not going to happen overnight. This is going to be gradual, and it's going to move more quickly than some people are going to feel comfortable with. But at the same time, it's our job to make sure that it can be and will be as smooth as it can be.
That's thoughtful. It's a thoughtful response. I want to pick up on the global competitiveness because from where I sit and what I've been seeing, we're losing our ability to compete, to attract capital because in my circles, we talk about regulatory uncertainty. We're talking about C-15 and the adoption of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We're not able to attract that capital for those bigger project infrastructure projects, which is going to spark on the SMEs to be able to be the best entrepreneurs they can be. How are we going to bolster our competitiveness in our country?
Well, don't forget that Canada is not the only country in the world that's committed to international greenhouse gas emission targets. Remember that there is a new administration in the United States, and that the political pressures on the Biden administration will be strong. We've already felt the impact of some of them, and there will be more. So don't think that Canada's competitive position internationally is going to be somehow apart from those same pressures and those political imperatives that President Biden is going to feel, from pressures within the Democratic Party, and that the kind of competition that you're talking about may take on a different hue and a different tone. And it's also true internationally if you look at what's happening in European countries. So we just have to be smarter, more aggressive, more inventive, and fully understanding that this is the nature of the new reality. Also, there is a very good argument to be made that we should be thinking more continentally, that maybe now is the time for a North American environment and energy strategy, where we can align the interests of Canada and the United States in a way that we couldn't have done 6 months ago or a number of years ago, and that should be full of opportunity for us on this side of the border. You may have read over the last couple of days just how interconnected we are with the United States. Through pipelines, through hydroelectric ties, the integration is absolutely overwhelming. And our future, whether we like it or not, as we maintain our sense of national identity and national sovereignty, there's no escaping that this major trading partner is also a major partner in the development of sustainable energy and the marketing of energy internationally. So I take comfort in that. I think our sensibilities are there. And also, I'm very encouraged by how far down the path, JP, to reconciliation we have traveled. I remember the first time you and I met, we talked about procurement and moving towards targets. You will remember that meeting. And I think that there is a much greater understanding today than there was even those few years ago about how essential it is going to be to move forward implementing these major infrastructure projects hand in hand with Indigenous peoples. That is the reality. And that, to me, is a very positive development in our national landscape.
No, thanks again. I always appreciate your thoughtfulness, and I absolutely understand the international connections. We've had some conversations. We've been sharing our story with Alaska to Alberta rail line and the permit that was signed by previous President Trump, and we're still moving ahead. It's multi-cargo, and there's the challenge around that line that we're experiencing now, ministers. We're working with a couple dozen primary Indigenous communities. And the challenge is many of these communities don't have access to timely capital to be equity, and we're very supportive of Indigenous equity. We've created 49% minimum for their participation, and I commend the government in their $1 billion commitment through the CIB to make sure that communities address that $35 billion deficit within the communities. But what visions do you have or can share, where we can actually get more capital to communities to participate in more of these infrastructure projects off their communities, because that's going to go hand in hand with industry. That's going to increase our competitiveness. That's going to reduce the regulatory burden. I think when Indigenous communities are seen as leading in partnership and true partnership with major companies.
I think all that's true. It's also really important that Indigenous communities have equity positions in these projects that creates a revenue stream. And when capital is required at the front end, there are public sector possibilities there. And also the private sector knows full well that Indigenous communities don't always enter partnerships with the same kind of capital possibility that the private sector does, and they'll have to compensate for that. But the major point is that it's just not going to happen anymore unless Indigenous communities are a part of it and part of it at the front end. And it's happening more and more because Indigenous leaders understand that to create economic opportunity for their children mean that they're going to have to enter into these agreements and these associations with private capital in order for all of us to benefit from these resources, more and more extracted sustainably, more and more in the patch of renewable energy possibilities. In Saskatchewan, you know about CCU, carbon capture, utilization, and storage. There are projects also in northern Alberta. More investment is coming. There will be more to say, I hope, in Chrystia Freeland's budget about how the government of Canada can participate. And all of this implies an understanding that partnership with Indigenous peoples is the way in which these projects will go ahead. Lord knows we've made enough mistakes. I hope we're smart enough to learn from them.
I agree. And, just looking at the sponsors here, I'm very familiar with Bruce Power, having been involved with OPG on their board and CN across all their communities and the port. These are organizations that understand it. And, there's one other thing that I wanted to ask you before, and then just go into summary, if you will, Minister, around, I think Indigenous people are our greatest strength quite often when we think about ESG these days, right? There's I in environment, there's I in social, there's I in governance. And ESG is going to be a more important reportable factor within corporations. From the environment, and you and I've spoken about this, I always admire your approach to your thoughtfulness to it, but putting Indigenous people in through like the Guardians program, the moccasins on the ground to actually showcase Canada and its Indigenous leadership to lead us into that sustainable future while responsibly developing our resources, absolutely fundamental. I guess the question is, how do we get more of that? And how do we get that acceptance? Because we're still in a country that still struggles with some really poor views of Indigenous people, and how, advocates like yourself that been around communities long enough that know better. What's your message?
By seeing this as a strength, and by seeing the value of the relationship between humans and the land and the air and the water, and to have deep respect for that relationship, and to understand that we are stewards. That is a very powerful lesson. And sometimes it's at odds with the compulsion of the moment. I want it and I want it now. Well, you may want it now, but what impact does that haste have on your children and on my grandchildren's generation? So it's the longer view. It's the more respectful view of that fundamental relationship, which is a great teaching. And we have to prove by our actions as a government that we have absorbed that teaching. And more importantly, that we learn from its communities. And not only do we learn by hearing about those values, but about participating in projects, and that we give that respect for the land, the air, and the water, everything that we do. So that is, for many, I hope, a revelation and insight into things that are very basic to the human condition, the way we relate to our natural environment, the way we relate to each other as people with diverse backgrounds. And that's where you need some wisdom, and that's where you need some leadership. And I see more of it today than I've seen ever, actually, in this moment of our development as a nation.
No, thank you. And, I think Canada's in the right place, the right time to show the world how we can be competitive in everything that we do and be leaders in the environment. So thank you, Minister. Last couple minutes to you, and then I'll wrap up for any of your last thoughts.
Oh. Well, I'm just glad to have this platform. It's a very respected group. You grab the attention of people. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Iris, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
JP, sorry. Can you? Okay.
Yes. Sorry.
Okay. So what we do is use platforms like this to spread the message, and more importantly, to listen to the message. I spend an awful lot of time listening to people in the prairie because listening well leads to good policy. And let's be candid about political failures. I can count the number of Liberal members of Parliament from Alberta and Saskatchewan in one hand. And that is because there was a failure to listen and a failure to deliver programs where prairie folk could see themselves in national policy. I think that's changed a little bit. I think it's changed a little bit because of the pandemic, where Canada stepped up. And I think a lot of people out west realize that the government of Canada invested hugely in people and in communities. And the relationship was direct. There was no ambiguity about where this support was coming from. It was coming from Canada. And it's at moments like this when most of us, at least those of us who believe in a strong, united Canada, bolstered by a strong prairie region, that this federation is very special. And when one part of our country suffers, the rest of the country has to step forward. And I think we see evidence of that. It's never as much as some would want. It's never as fast as some would hope. But overall, I believe that the country is responding in a way in which most of us can be proud that the Federation is strong. It can be stronger. Let's make it stronger by delivering for people in regions where they feel as if they're not part of the center of decision making. That's my job, to make them feel to be a part of the center.
Thank you. Thank you. Great way to end our session this morning, Jim. Thank you so much, Minister Carr. And Iris, thank you for your thoughtfulness. Thanks to the audience for tuning in today, our sponsors. This is the start, opening webinar of the Change Conference. It's going to be spread over the next few weeks. And this was a wonderful way to start it off. Tomorrow, noon Eastern time, join us for a webinar with Natural Resources Minister Seamus O'Regan in conversation with Brian Gallant. And at 7 p.m. Eastern time, we're going to have an all-party panel to talk about the year ahead in Parliament with MPs Ruby Sahota, Karen Vetcho, and Lindsay Matheson, and Senators Francis Lincoln, and in conversation with Indira Naidoo-Harris. So you can check out everything at the pearsoncentre.ca. Again, thank you so much for a great conversation. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.